Welcome to the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. I'm coming to you today from Washington, D.C., where our guest is not in Washington, D.C., but my home state, Wisconsin, Rachel Campos-Duffy. Rachel is a Fox News contributor. She's a mother of 9. She's the author of the book. Rachel, remind me the title of the book again.
Paloma Wants to Be Lady Freedom. Paloma is my daughter, so it's named after my daughter.
One of your many daughters.
One of my six.
Well, why don't you actually tell us a little bit about this book in particular, because it has an interesting message, I think, right now as we are talking about the George Floyd protests that have spread around the country and this renewed conversation really about race relations in America, about the foundations of our republic. We're having all of these conversations. We're even talking about the value of Thomas Jefferson statues once again. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the book's message right now, and as it might resonate with people right now.
Sure. So the book is Paloma Wants to Be Lady Freedom. It was sort of inspired by real life events, which is that my daughter, who is now 12, but was at the time, she's 11. She was at the time 4. When we went to Washington, D.C., when Sean was first elected, she absolutely fell in love with Lady Freedom, which is a statue on the top of the U.S. Capitol. And so I learned everything I could about it. And it's a beautiful statue. And this book is about a little girl who gets lost inside the U.S. Capitol. But in the process, she falls in love with Lady Freedom, which is the statue. And by the way, my daughter got lost in Disney World once, so that for the whole getting lost thing happened. So it is based loosely on all these events. But, I wrote this book because my kids had this front row seat to American politics and really to Washington, D.C., to our nation's capital, which is so steeped in history and so beautiful. And I think the real thing I wanted to accomplish, because I couldn't find books that were very many books that were patriotic. All the books for little kids these days, all the publishers who are the gatekeepers and the editors to all the things that our kids are picking up at Barnes & Noble and Amazon, are all focused on diversity. And I think diversity is fine and good, but I think there's such an emphasis on what makes us different on diversity that we're forgetting to tell the stories about what we have in common. And that is that we're Americans, that we love freedom, that we have this common history that, while imperfect, is still better than anyone else's history, and try so much harder to be inclusive and to correct itself. And so I wanted to write a book that was unabashedly patriotic. It so happens that the little girl in the book, her father is a recent immigrant, and that's why their family took this trip to the U.S. Capitol. And my mother became a citizen at around the same age as the little girl in the book. And I didn't really have as great of an appreciation as I think I should have had for what that citizenship process is and for what it means to be an American. Because when you're born an American, you just kind of take for granted what that is. And so I wanted to tell this book also through the eyes of her father, who has this wonderful, beautiful appreciation for what it means to be an American and what that means for his daughter. She's born free. She has the opportunity to work and make something of herself in a way that in other countries you simply can't. So that's the book. It's still on Amazon. It was the #1 children's book about America for a while, and actually did quite well when it first came out, but it's still there and it's still selling. And so I hope people grab it, because I think now more than ever, we need to talk about what we have in common. There's so much, I'm hearing from BLM about, wanting to have segregated hospitals and segregated graduation ceremonies that are going on now. This is so silly and so antithetical to everything we've worked towards.
Yeah, and you're really the perfect person to have this conversation with, because you have experience in the news media, you have experience in DC politics, you have experience which is lacking in the conservative world in entertainment media, and you also have the experience of living as a Hispanic American, raising Hispanic American kids. And one thing that you mentioned is so interesting is this is not a message that's being told by the gatekeepers at the publishing houses. And we see that replicated everywhere else in culture. We see that replicated not just at the publishing publishing houses, but at the movie studios and at the television networks and at, you know, the newsrooms of the Washington Post and the New York Times. And I wonder, I'm just curious for your thoughts of how conservatives can start to change that tide. How can conservatives, especially, and you said something else really interesting, is now more than ever, we have to talk about what brings us together. But now more than ever, it's incredibly difficult to have that conversation because even the statues of Thomas Jefferson are being taken down, and Christopher Columbus, and some of these sort of things that we used to all agree on. So how is, you know, it's a kind of a loaded question. It's a tough question, but how do you think we can actually start as conservatives to change the tide of the left's monopoly on our culture, especially at a time when it's more difficult to even make inroads with those conversations?
And I'm afraid that what's happened over the last month is going to make it even harder. I hate to say that, Emily, but it really is true. When I tried to get this book out, I had publishing houses that were not conservative, very interested in the book. I was doing rewrites with them. And then Donald Trump was elected and I got ghosted. And that's when I decided to go to Regnery, which was a conservative publishing house. But I think that I don't think it's coincidental, is what I think. I think that when he was elected, I think people on the other side became even more, I don't know if the word jealous or protective of what they own, which is culture. And they were not going to give this a platform. And you see it now with Paw Patrol. I was just on Fox and Friends this weekend talking about it. Do I think Paw Patrol will continue? Yes. Do I think that a new cartoon about kind, wonderful, helpful policemen is going to get green-lighted anytime soon? Heck no, I don't. And I think the same for books like mine. And which is why I think the first thing, to go back to your question, is those books that are out there like mine, and there are others, you need to support them. Podcasts and anything that we're doing right, that we're getting into the culture on some level. As conservatives, we need to support it. Movies, we need to show our voice, because money does talk. But ultimately, I knew Andrew Breitbart. He was a enormous, I don't know if I ever met a bigger railroad fan, almost crazed fan than Andrew Breitbart. So he saw me once and he beeline towards me at this event we were at and stole me away for the whole remainder of the night, and we were fast friends ever since. Andrew Breitbart was 100% right. If all the money we had spent on PACs and all these other, think tanks and everything we've done, if we had just bought a TV studio or a movie studio, we'd probably be ahead. And I think that conservatives have been very late to figuring out the game that the left plays, which is that culture matters. And they have been so successful at the academic level and at the entertainment Hollywood level. And it's really going to be difficult for us unless we start to get smart. There's money out there, right? We see the money in elections. And by the way, I've had a lot of time to think about why there is so much hate towards Donald Trump. I'm 100%, I've given lots of speeches about it. There is no doubt in my mind that Donald Trump's just being a pop culture figure that he was, that is exactly why they hated him. That is exactly why they had to crush him, because he had joined the Republican Party and that was an existential threat to them. Donald Trump is in every single conversation. I don't care if it's LeBron James or, anything that's happening in culture, he comments on. He was commenting, by the way, on Twilight before he was, the breakup between the two stars of Twilight before it was even a president. If you go back to the Twitter feed, he was saying, dump her, she's terrible. She treated you like crap. He's been involved and commenting and being a part of pop culture since long before he was ever a candidate. And that's why they hate him. They're afraid of him because he has that understanding, whether it's WWF, to reality television shows, to everything in between. The guy he's a creature of pop culture.
Is there anybody else like that in the conservative world? And maybe it's a future Donald Trump is still on the left. I don't know. But is there anybody else? I mean, I can't think of any major conservative figure right now tweeting about what the modern equivalent of the Twilight breakup would be. And so it's one of those things when you think about Donald Trump, who could possibly, he seems so singular. He seems like something that could never be replicated by someone else. And so that question lingers, is it too late for conservatives to buy movie studios? How else can conservatives be in the pop culture? Because there also gets this question of being in the pop culture, but not of the pop culture, which I think is an increasingly difficult formula as well. It's just hard to imagine how conservatives can make significant inroads post-Trump, particularly during the Trump administration, when, you know, we can't even have a conversation about LeBron James without everybody being, you know, it's impossible. It's impossible to have that conversation without it devolving into shouting.
Right. Well, what makes Donald Trump so interesting, you said there's no one like him. It's so American, right? I mean, he's just so unique, his own person. There will not be anyone like him. And frankly, this experiment in having this businessman sort of, you know, TV mogul. I mean, if it doesn't work now, no one will ever try it again, because, you know, the abuse that he's taken, the kind of hits he's taken, I don't know anyone else. I have pretty thick skin. I always say I'm like an armadillo. I actually enjoy reading my mean tweets. I can handle it. But I don't know if I could survive 4 days as Donald Trump, with as thick as my skin is from having been in reality TV and hearing, you know, mean comments about my looks or whatever since I was 22, you know? So I have pretty thick skin. I don't know if anybody else would try to do that, but I think your question is a good one. And that is, you know, moving forward, what are conservatives going to do? I think we're going to have to well, one thing we are doing is we're learning to fight back. And we saw that. And that is a direct relation to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is teaching Republicans and conservatives to fight back. And we saw that, I think, most interestingly and most effectively with the Kavanaugh case, with the attacks on Kavanaugh, and then in the Covington case, where citizen journalists and people like yourself who had a platform were talking about this. People like me were going on TV as well talking about it. And we all got together, those of us that have some sort of platform, and pointed out how false it was. And we were able, thank God, to get video that altered that narrative, and we were able to fight back. And that kid has won some cases because of that. But that's how we fight back. But it's not, I don't know, as far as, you know, Duck Dynasty was an effective sort of portrayal of conservatives. There are some, but we need more.
Well, and so the children's book example is so good. It's such a good one, in my opinion, because when I think about how my worldview was shaped, a lot of it really did come. I mean, it starts so young, and you're a mother of 9 children. You understand this, and you obviously have to navigate these kind of tricky waters with your own children. And I have to imagine it's only getting more difficult in terms of the culture, but it just makes you think how vast the left's control over everything in pop culture is. And so like Duck Dynasty is an exception to this rule, but there's just so many subtle, like liberalism or progressivism, I should say, is promoted so subtly through the culture. It is in things like children's books now. And so it's sort of in every crevice of pop culture from a young age. It's just sort of like through osmosis. How can children possibly be expected to think another way? And the best answer, I think, right now is the democratization of media, of social media, of, you know, people like Ben Shapiro having, you know, the reach that he does on video, things like that. I think that has to be the best answer.
It is, but we do have one weapon that they don't have, and that is we have, and that we underestimate, and we need to use and wield more, and that is the first most important, most powerful influence and teacher in any child's life is their parent or grandparent. And so what we've done, what I think too many conservatives have done, is sort of ceded that to the teachers, to Hollywood stars, to sports stars. And so they just assume their kids are going to, through osmosis, being in their home or just being, in the blood, they're going to get it. It doesn't happen that way. So if you're not explaining things to your kids, if you're not using that time on the way to the soccer game to talk about capitalism or socialism, because if you're not talking about socialism with your kids, somebody else is, and they're going to present a different idea than what you or I think about socialism. Every time I see a video or an article about what's happening in Venezuela, we have our family group chat. I send it there. We talk about things. If you have a small business, take your kids to your small business and show them how it works. Talk to them about how you pay your employees and what role you play in the community. Because what's happening is too many parents are just letting the teachers do it. And I can tell you, one thing that quarantine did for me, I paid a little closer attention to so I have some kids in Catholic school and some in public. One of my kids was in a public school class that was straight up pro-communist China. They were getting videos with no context about population control being great. They were Chinese videos produced by Chinese entities, and it was pro-population control, pro-forced abortion. I was out of my mind, and I was shocked at what I was seeing. I'm somebody who talks about this stuff. It's worse than I thought. And it didn't come to me until quarantine when we're all busy, right? How many of us sit down and watch, go through the teacher's curriculum? Well, the teacher's curriculum was online with all the links to all the videos. And I went one after another with my son. And I was like, this is a Chinese propaganda class. It was unbelievable. And now,
it's a school in Wisconsin.
And it's a school in Wisconsin, exactly. Yeah. You think you're insulated, you're not, just because you live in red state. Because what they have also, Emily, is they own the teachers' colleges. The left is in charge of the teachers' colleges. And now they're taking control of the medical schools and injecting all that stuff into there, which is why you saw so few doctors willing to stand up in the face of all the different data that was coming up in the pandemic. And I even had a friend who was a psychiatrist, a working psychiatrist, who wrote about what's the drug that the president
hydroxychloroquine.
Exactly. Well, her daughter has lupus. She wrote about it, and the Wisconsin licensing board somebody turned her into them, and she had to go and defend herself as a long-time licensed psychiatrist for why she was saying positive things about this, even though she prescribes it and her own daughter takes it and has never had an issue with it. That's how politicized the medical boards are becoming, the medical schools are becoming, and that's already the teachers' colleges are just done. I mean, they own them.
Yeah, I've heard that from students in teaching colleges as well. And it is sort of like, it's interesting how the quarantine and the pandemic have clarified some things. And people are saying right now, like the maxim used to be, wait till these crazy college students get out into the working world. Like they're just going to, have their butts whipped. No, it's actually the other way around. Now we see they're in the working.
Yes.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And, people like us, we follow this issue more closely because we're in the news media. And it's something that, conservatives are concerned about college campuses. But I think people for too long took for granted this idea that, of course, college campuses are liberal. And they didn't notice what was happening, which was that a much more radical strain of progressivism was developing. And it was catching hold with millennials, with people, even with Gen Z now. And everyone is suddenly astounded to learn how radical that strain of progressivism is, but it's too late. I mean, it's already out in the working world. It's already out there. We're already having
Congress, Emily. I mean, AOC and Ilhan Omar are the perfect cases of the fruits of what they have done at the university level. And mind you, I do not think that Donald Trump, first of all, when AOC came out of the blue, beat that incumbent, very powerful congressman in that primary in New York. And I remember people laughing about it. And I said, no, Do not laugh. This woman is powerful. She's savvy. She's fearless. She's as fearless as Donald Trump, truly. I mean, there is a match there in some ways. One has a lot more experience and understands business. The other one is economically, just dumb. But
she has an econ degree.
So great. I have an econ degree too. And I go, what happened here? But I would say that she's powerful, and there would have been no impeachment were it not for that, for AOC. AOC basically forced Nancy Pelosi's hand. That is very powerful for a freshman to do that. For the pack she's built that she's now primarying, powerful people, even in the Congressional Black Caucus, they don't like her because she's primarying some of them, or supporting primaries against some of them. She is powerful, she is fearless, and she understands exactly what we're talking about, that the future is on her side. The army is coming up behind her, and those guys are dying out. That party that, that used to be where Joe Biden was, now Joe Biden's trying to pretend like he's, more with it and more woke, but that is dying. This new crop is up, and she knows she's got the power.
Yeah, she's a great person to talk about because actually she is someone who has been accepted and promoted by the celebrity class and by the sort of glossy magazine. She's been in Vogue. She had an HBO documentary that she was really the focus of, chronicling her run for Congress. And so let's talk about pop culture, because it's something that, you see elevate people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and their ideas, even in places where it shouldn't be, or not that it shouldn't be, it's just you wouldn't expect to find politics. And we're both really big fans of Bravo, and politics pops up on Bravo. Do you remember the episode where they were arguing about Kavanaugh on the, I think it was the Beverly Hills Housewives? It was Camille Grammer was having an argument with the ladies about Kavanaugh.
Remember that episode? Tell me, I'm fascinated.
Yeah, so they got into this, they were filming a dinner party during the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, and Camille Grammer was standing up for Brett Kavanaugh. And she was saying, I've, experienced false accusations, and the other women are saying, I've experienced sexual misconduct or assault. And so there's these two, like, they're butting heads because they're both claiming to have had a similar experience and using it really as their argumentation. And Camille is like crying because she's just getting piled on. It's a really interesting episode.
That's fascinating. I do remember the episode where there was going to be a Hillary Clinton victory party. Do you remember that?
Yeah, it's New York. Yeah, Carol Radziwill, yeah.
And I only now found out that Dora is her late husband was connected to George Soros. I didn't know that until very recently.
Yes,
Dorinda's a lot actually about her.
Dorinda's husband, Richard Medley.
Dorinda, yes.
Yeah, he worked for one of Soros's organizations. I believe he worked in the State Department. He was a congressional staffer for some Democrats. Yeah, he was pretty connected. And that's an interesting thing about the New York Housewives, is that they do have some of these like very interesting connections. But as someone who was on reality television, Rachel was on Real World. You were also on Road Rules, weren't you?
Yeah, that's where Sean and I met. We did Road Rules All Stars. Where they picked one person from each of the first 5 seasons, and I was picked from my cast, and Sean was picked from his cast, and that's how we literally met on TV. We actually have, Emily, the moment we met is on television. Is captured on TV. We have it.
Have your kids seen it?
Yeah. My kids have seen it, and yeah.
That's amazing. So what season of Real World were you?
I was in season 3 in San Francisco, and then Sean was in season 5 in Boston. And then literally 3 months after his season ended, he did All Stars, and then I was selected for my cast, and then we've been together ever since.
So what is it like to be on Road Rules? Because that show, I feel like it came before a lot of things that are similar to it now, but it was its own thing.
Yeah, so I think the actual Road Rules show, if you were cast in the real show, it was like a 3-month travel adventure. They compacted ours into a month. But, it's like traveling with, when you're young. Obviously, our accommodations were a little better. We did like really cool stuff. We scaled the tallest building in Auckland, New Zealand. They took us to New Zealand. We went all over the country. We did all kinds of really amazing things. But in the end, it's just, when you travel with a bunch of people, I actually was dating someone when I went on, and Sean was, pretty kind of single. But that
single.
kind of single. But I think, when you travel, it's very bonding, and also doing a reality show is very bonding because, at that time, especially, very few people knew what it was like to be in a reality show. We really were the beginning of it. This was, think about it, 25 years ago, or 20 years ago. Sean and I have been married 21. So, reality TV is about 25 years old as we know it since MTV.
Yeah.
And so very few people knew what it was like. And so you were suddenly famous for no reason at all other than you were on TV, right? And a lot of people wanted to hang out with you, and you really didn't know who really liked you for you and who didn't. So a lot of us just ended up gravitating towards each other because we had this common experience. We knew that no one was, Sean was certainly not dating me because I was on TV, because he was on TV too. So, it just kind of took that out of the equation. You could really focus on, how much you had in common. And that was what was so great about, I think, the early Real World. And I know I sound kind of like grandma-ish, it's sort of like back when reality TV was, great. But there was this period of time when reality TV, and it was up to about, I think, season 4 of the Real World, started to veer off into 4 or 5 of the Real World. I'm sorry, Sean was on season 6. Miami became more sexualized, and I think they changed directors. And I think one of the directors, I believe that what we hear is that he had been involved in soft porn. So obviously the show took a different direction. But
That'll do it.
Early shows were very much about social issues and race and class, and we talked about politics a lot. And my season was very famous for having had the first time someone with AIDS. And you have to think about it, this was shot in 1993 when there still was no cure for AIDS, and we were living with someone with AIDS. So there was a lot of questions and debates about that, and it was a very fascinating sort of social experiment. And what I like about the Real Housewives is, even though they don't overtly cover politics, but it is a show that is clearly very regional. You realize how regional America is when you watch that show. You realize a lot of class issues that come up that we kind of paper over come up in this. And the other thing I love about Housewives is these women, I don't care how they vote, they are unabashedly capitalists. Everyone has something they're trying to promote, something they're getting behind. So there's a lot of interesting angles about it besides just enjoying, women behaving badly.
That's a really interesting point, because they are all incredible entrepreneurs. Almost every single one of them uses the Housewives platform to debut some sort of brand, whether it's dog food, like in Dallas, or toaster ovens.
Remember the toaster oven that Sonia?
Yes, it's incredible. She's an international lifestyle brand.
Yes, some of them did sex toys. Some of them did clothing lines. I mean, everyone, and I mean, most famously Bethany,
Skinny
girl, right? I mean, and then sold it off, and she's a gazillionaire now. So
Yeah.
I do think they're all very entrepreneurial. They're all very, very interesting in that way. They all understand that this is a platform. I wish I had known when I was doing the show that it could have been used to make money. I just assumed it was going to help me get dates. That was it.
Well, it did.
I have no regrets on it.
I'm wondering, so just on the capitalism point quickly, there's such an interesting moment in this season of the New York Housewives, and even for people who dismiss the Housewives as inconsequential or even worse, they get into a shouting match in the Hamptons in an episode, and one of them screams, Leah McSweeney, actually, who's been a guest on Federalist Radio Hour, screams at Sonia Morgan, who was married into the Morgan family before her divorce, "Don't get all socialite on me." And Sonia screams back, "Don't get all socialist on me." And it's this Beautiful exchange.
It was a great exchange. There are little gems like that in the show for sure. Absolutely. You know what else I like too? Depending on which season, you see the importance of family. So whatever you say about the Jersey ladies,
yes,
family is like the center of their lives, and I could really relate at least to that, in that, and you know, the way they care for their family, the way they care for their husbands, the way they want to make sure that, you know, it's just interesting. It's not duplicated in all the other seasons, and so that was also interesting to see which seasons did family play more prominently.
Yeah, family is a really big factor on Jersey and Atlanta, it seems like, specifically.
Yeah, and also Miami. I thought Miami did too with the Latin culture. I miss Miami. I wish they had continued with that. I don't know what happened there.
R.I.P. to Mama Elsa.
Yeah, exactly.
Passed away last year. Wonderful. That was a wonderful franchise. So getting into this, actually, I am curious how reality television, you've watched its evolution. I'm curious as to how your season of Real World was filmed, like even just technically, like how the cameras were in the house, because that kind of Real World kind of gave way to Big Brother. And then we saw Jersey Shore, and they're all sort of different. But I'm wondering, in 1993, which, by the way, was the year I was born, how the Real World, like how the cameras were in the house and when they would follow you to work or whatever it was.
Sure. So first of all, the people who filmed are the directors, the two directors. One was a documentarian. The executive director came from soap operas. And the other one was just, I guess, a very successful television director. So you have this combination where I think they were, because the documentarian was involved at that level, there was a real desire to make it sort of, you know, a true docu-soap, you know. Yep. And no one ever told us, you know, no one ever planted drinks so that we would all get drunk and do certain things. They really tried to just let us live our lives. There were cameras that would record black and white sort of footage in the corners of our bedrooms. There were no cameras in bathrooms. Our bathroom was, we used it all, so it was, you know, not separated by gender, but it wasn't like some of later episodes where they were filming in the bathroom and the bathrooms were, you know, for both sexes. It wasn't like that at all. We had a camera, I would say, you know, 16 to 20 hours a day in our house or following us. So it was a lot of filming. If I went for a jog, I would say half the time they would follow me in a van open, with the door open filming, and then they'd get bored at some point when they realize I'm just, you know, running. But they'd collect B-roll footage that way. I would say it was, everything you saw was exactly as it was. However, there were things that they could do in editing that weren't true. And the best example I have is in my house, we had this amazing fish tank with all these tropical fish from Hawaii in it. And we had this fish guy that would come and take care of it from the company. And our house was super deluxe. It was right, you know, off the crooked street in San Francisco, gorgeous. I mean, we all thought we'd hit the lottery. You know, nobody at 21 or 22 ever lived in anything like this. And there was this giant, gorgeous fish tank. Well, for some reason, the fish started dying. And I seemed to be the only one really me and somebody else but very few of us seemed to be as concerned about the fish dying. I was very upset. And I kept getting angry that the fish guy was supposed to come and the fish were dying. And so I'd spend time, you know, kind of looking and, you know, so I could report back, you know, the fish guy's not doing his job, the fish are dying. And there was an episode where this Pac gets kicked out of her house and there's a lot of drama and I was really a good friend of his. So they tried to show, you know, through the film or through the show that I was sad that he was gone. And so what they did is they showed me like being really upset looking at the fish tank.
You gotta be kidding me, seriously?
The episode is like me and like they use B-roll footage and it's me looking at the fish tank, but I know exactly what's happening. Like I'm sad because there's dying fish in the fish tank, but it's made to look like I'm sad and, you know, sort of pining, you know, looking at for this roommate. So could they twist things like that? Absolutely, they could do that. But for the most part, I have no qualms with what I saw. What you saw is what it was.
How do you, because people say, this is a typical refrain you hear from reality stars, is you get used to the cameras. And I think the best reality stars are the ones who do truly get used to the cameras, to the point where they're living their everyday lives in front of the cameras, and they don't care that the cameras are there, because they're just the kind of person, they're Snooki. They're gonna act like Snooki regardless of whether or not there's a camera there. So I'm curious, as for you, did you get used to the camera? How does having a camera in front of your table when you're having a conversation at dinner, how does that impact you? Is there a way that you can try to not let it impact you? And even if you're trying, you're still trying, so it's still changing the way that you're conversing. How did that end up impacting you?
It's such a great question, because I think for about 3 weeks, you can fake who you are. You can try and be, but after a while, the real you shows up. And I would say that part of why you see what, at least on my episode, for the most part, there was one person, I'm not going to say who, but there was one person who I think was a little older, a little more controlled understood more what was going to happen. I would say for most of us, it was new, the whole reality TV concept. We really the show really exploded after my episode aired. It was a curiosity, sort of the first 2 seasons before mine, and then it exploded in popularity. I had no idea what was going to happen. I think there was one person, our cast member, who was a bit older than us, I think a little savvier, and had a pretty good idea of what was going to happen. And I sometimes wonder if some of the things that happened were a little bit shaped by that. That said, I would say they casted for people who were just kind of really comfortable with themselves. And one of the things that happened to me, Emily, and I went through like 8 different steps in the audition process. And at the final last thing, they flew me into LA, and they met with me. And then they said, listen, thank you. We're meeting with other people. This is the finals. And I actually saw some of people at the hotel I was at that later I later realized they were cast members. I didn't know at the time. And they said, but you have to be here at 11 o'clock, we're going to call you the next morning. Well, my brother, who was a Marine, happened to be in town. And so I went out with all these Marines that night, and they all got wasted, and they're afraid to like drive, right? Because they're Marines and they can get in big trouble. So they rented a room, and I was so pissed because I was stuck in this hotel room with a bunch of drunk Marines, and I needed to get back, and they didn't wake up, and I kept trying to get my brother up. And when I got back to my hotel, like at 3 o'clock, I mean, these guys were horrible. There was like message after message after message after message. And I said to my brother, I'm like, thanks a lot. I'm not going to get the show because I wasn't here when they wanted. Come to find out later, after I filmed the show, I asked one of the producers, why did you guys pick me? And they said, we really weren't sure about you because, you come from this conservative family and we knew your parents were really strict. But then when you didn't show up, you didn't take our call and nobody could locate you, they're like, she's perfect.
That is so good.
That story. So I think there's some of it comes through the casting where they kind of you're somebody can find yourself in interesting situations. But also I think having a camera around you all the time, it would be so hard to control yourself in tense situations because you're so used to those people. They become like the furniture or like a friend.
That brings me really to the last thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is cancel culture has now come for reality television, which I think says a lot about cancel culture. Because if cancel culture is sort of aiming its fire at reality television, we realize how ridiculous cancel culture is, because reality television often isn't casting people as protagonists. It's either casting them as just real people or as kind of like they're the main characters, but you're laughing at them because they're doing stupid stuff. You're gasping at them, especially the Housewives, especially this is true on Vanderpump Rules, which just saw 4 people leave the show because of cancel culture. Stassi, Kristen, Max, and Brett. Stassi and Kristen, you could not find Stassi says in the first season of Vanderpump Rules, "I'm evil and don't forget it." This is the first season she says that. And her and Kristen were canceled for, I would say, some racially insensitive conduct. And real world, your experience in the real world is such a good example, because there's that infamous fight between Kevin and Julie. I think that was on the first season.
Yes.
Where they hash out this racial conflict in front of the country. And if you trust the American people to watch it and come to their own conclusion, racism is what looks ugly. It comes across looking disgusting and reprehensible. And it's, reality television is actually a great medium for America to have these conversations and these arguments. What do you think it says that cancelers now want to take a Stassi or a Kristen whose entire career has been built on them doing stupid and crazy things, and say, we're going to hold you to the same standards of political correctness and decent behavior and morality that we would hold maybe a politician to?
Right, I totally agree. And again, I think we lose this opportunity to have these conversations. I mean, I see this as a minority. I think there's too much emphasis on, we talked about this at the beginning of our conversation. I believe there's too much emphasis on race. I think we're talking way too much about what we have, what we don't have in common versus what we do have in common. But that said, the other side is constantly saying, we need to have more conversations about race. Yes. But no one wants to have the conversation about race, because we're all going to get canceled, because what inevitably happens is somebody is going to say something that somebody else finds insensitive. And if their entire life now, I mean, Stassi may not ever work in Hollywood again because of
everybody
that.
Dropped her. Publisher dropped her. Everybody dropped her. Agent.
Yes, absolutely. We even saw this with, you and I talked a little bit about the off camera about the Meghan Markle and her BFF, is it Jessica, her BFF?
Yes, this is great, because Rachel's very passionate about this point.
Yes, so she's also so this is interesting, because she has a black Canadian, I believe, girl. So these girls are Canadian, the best friend, and this black influencer that works with her. And the black influencer said, I think we should talk about BLM. And basically Jessica says, I don't think we should. I think we should, that's not really our brand. I think what does she do? She does like style. She's a stylist or something, right? And so now she got basically fired in part, not because of what she said, so much as what she didn't want to talk about. So that's an interesting thing as well. If you're not sufficiently woke, you may get fired, as well as if you step in it, and you can get fired. And the thing is, people like you and I, we do a lot of TV. If you do a lot of TV, you're gonna step in it at some point. If you have a camera on you for 20 hours a day on a reality television show, you're going to say something that somebody finds offensive. And instead of us talking about it, we just fire them. Then that whole premise that we all need to talk about race is bullshit.
Yeah, say it.
Bullshit. Because either we can talk about it or we can't talk about it. Either we're allowed to make mistakes and learn from them, or we're not. And what will end up happening is, and this is what's scary to me, is it feels a little bit like China. It feels like if you didn't show up at the protest, at the BLM protest, if you didn't blank your social media screen, you're also guilty, and of being maybe a closet racist. And so that sounds very Chinese, right? I mean, if you don't show up to the Communist Party protest, your family, might be in trouble, in China. I don't like any of this at all. And by the way, I don't like what happened in Minneapolis. I think it was reprehensible, but I don't like Black Lives Matter's movement either, because I know what it's about. It is not a racial movement. It's an anti-capitalist, pro-Marxist movement. And so no one knows that. It seems like everyone just wants to prove their wokeness. And that's the danger, I think, that we're in right now. And again, that it's going to reality TV. You bring up such a great point, Emily, because if we can't have these conversations with the sort of bad girls and bad guys of reality TV, then no one can have these conversations. And that means no one is ever going to talk about race unless it's in a very calculated, pre-approved way to talk about race.
That's really depressing.
It is. It is.
How do you, I mean, as somebody who's raising 9 children, the youngest of which is very young, how do you, I mean, the future looks bleak right now, and I don't want to project onto you. Maybe you don't feel the same way, but looking at the culture, looking at where our culture is, and this conversation that we're having around race right now, I think reveals a lot of the problems that lie ahead for us, whether that's talking about race relations, whether that's talking about sex and gender, whatever it is, we can't have the conversation. And so looking ahead into your children's future, how do you deal with that? How are you feeling right now?
Well, it's interesting, being also the spouse of a politician and being in an interracial marriage, right? So I'm Hispanic, my husband's white. I was really struck. It really became very clear to me that there were certain things I could say that he couldn't, which seems really stupid in America, and unfair. And so maybe the onus is a little bit on some of us minority conservatives to get out there and speak, because maybe there are some things that we can say. Maybe there are some things that we also know a little bit about. I mean, I certainly know that my father experienced some forms of racism. But I was taught not to be a victim. You know, I'm sure maybe some of the people who are listening, I was up for The View. I lost twice that job on The View. I was literally up to the finals, me and somebody else. I was up for jobs at my network that I didn't get. I could be that person that just says, it's racism. That's why I didn't get it. It's because I'm Latina. I lost out to those white girls. I could be that person, but I'm not going to give my power over that way. I'm just not going to do it. And when I do that, if I do that, I will never look at myself and say, what could I have done better? How can I be better so the next time this opportunity presents itself to me, I can do better? I think that there is a victim culture that it ends up becoming very self-defeating for minorities. And that's what I'm trying to teach my kids is when there's a problem, when you don't get a job, when you didn't get a scholarship, when something didn't happen the way you like, look at you first. Look at you first. Because this is the greatest country in the world. I don't believe there's systemic racism. I believe there are racists in this country, but I don't believe there is systemic racism. And I think this idea of being a victim and blaming it on the system and blaming it on the man ends up hurting us as minorities because we end up not looking at ourselves and what we could do better when the next opportunity comes along. And that's the lesson, I think, for all of us.
And you know what's been remarkable to watch over the past few years, but especially clarified over the past couple of weeks, is just how difficult it is for you to even say that as a minority, that your minority status the left does not care about it. It doesn't matter that you're speaking as somebody with the experiences that they elevate on the pyramid of intersectionality. What's really just at the top of intersectionality is progressivism. And as it must take the flack that you must get as somebody speaking from a conservative perspective as a Hispanic American has to be intense.
Yeah, there's a special abuse that people like Michelle Malkin and Candace Owens, anyone who is a minority who dares to go against that. But also, they can't call us racist. So we got that.
They try though. They try.
They try, or maybe they say we're self-loathing. I find most of the most woke Hispanics that come after me on Twitter for somehow betraying my race or even my gender.
Latinx.
Yeah, exactly. Those tend to be people who don't even speak Spanish, so it kind of cracks me up.
That's fantastic.
People who are more unsure about who they are, or more maybe they're a mixed race, or maybe they're for whatever reason they tend to be some of the worst enforcers of what we are supposed to believe as Latinos, and it's just unfair. And so I constantly fight against that, and I try and empower my kids to just be free thinkers. You happen to be Hispanic, okay? We do eat a lot of Mexican food in my house. But that doesn't have anything to do with what's in here or what's in here.
Mm. That is fantastic. See, now we were going to end on a depressing note. Now I feel like we're ending on a much happier note. Rachel, you've been so generous with your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily.
Where can people follow you on Twitter?
Campos-Duffy is my handle, and same on Facebook, Campos-Duffy. So.
And the name of the book again?
It's Paloma Wants to Be Lady Freedom. Can I say one last thing before I go?
Yes, please.
I know I said this before, but I have to re-emphasize it. Parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, you have more power over how your kids turn out than the teachers, than the Marxist professors, than the culture, than the NBA player. But if you're not talking to your kids, if you're not teaching them, then those other people will become the role models. So please take that very seriously, because we can feel so helpless up against a liberal pop culture, but we have to realize that we still have our families.
And a great line that you said earlier in the podcast that I think is going to stick with a lot of people is, if you're not talking to your kids about socialism, somebody else is. And I'm sure that parents around the country have had that experience.
Yes.
All right. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being here today. This has been another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky. She's Rachel Campos-Duffy. We'll be back with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.